This flight was supposed to be just another trip, but the moment I helped an elderly woman, an overzealous flight attendant decided I was public enemy number one. Rules were thrown around, threats were made, and chaos unfolded. But trust me, what happened next turned the entire plane upside down, and that's just the beginning. Barron Trump, 19 years old and already a head taller than most, stepped onto the plane with a casualness that somehow made him stand out even more. Flying commercial wasn't exactly the norm for someone with his last name, but Barron had a thing for keeping it simple, or at least trying to. Business class suited him just fine, even if the hushed murmurs and not-so-subtle glances from fellow passengers reminded him that simplicity was never going to be part of his reality. The cabin was buzzing with its usual mix of travelers, corporate types glued to their laptops, frazzled parents wrangling cranky toddlers, and a group of college kids whispering loudly about who exactly had just walked in. A woman in her 40s nudged her seatmate and nodded in Barron's direction, her excitement barely contained. Meanwhile, Barron adjusted his hoodie, located his seat, and sank into it like this was just another day. Because for him, it kinda was. The flight crew was another story. Jessica Rivers, the lead flight attendant, had been in the business long enough to spot trouble before it even began, or so she liked to think. And to her, Barron Trump spelled potential for drama. Known for running her cabin with an iron fist and a tight smile, Jessica wasn't the type to be starstruck. In fact, she seemed almost determined not to be impressed. "Good afternoon, sir," she greeted Barron with the kind of smile that felt more like a dare. "Are you certain this is your seat? We typically find that passengers of your standing prefer first class." Barron glanced up briefly. "This is where I booked. Thanks." His answer was so nonchalant it seemed to throw Jessica off her game. Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Of course," she said, before striding away with an air of someone who wasn't quite done. As the flight prepared for takeoff, the cabin settled into its usual rhythm, bags being shoved into overhead compartments, passengers adjusting their seats, and the obligatory pre-flight safety demonstration droning on. That's when an elderly African-American woman sitting behind Barron struggled to retrieve her bag from the overhead bin. The bag was clearly too heavy for her, and as people around her either ignored the situation or pretended not to notice, Barron stood up. He reached for the bag with ease, handing it down to her with a polite nod. "Here you go, ma'am." The woman's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, young man. It's not often people take the time to help anymore." Barron offered a small smile and returned to his seat, but the moment didn't go unnoticed. Jessica appeared almost immediately, her professional veneer cracking just a little. "Sir," she said, her voice sharp but polite enough to not cause a scene. "Yet. For safety reasons, we ask passengers not to handle other people's luggage. That's what the crew is here for." Barron gave her a calm look. "She needed help, so I helped." Jessica's expression tightened. "While I appreciate the sentiment, please leave it to us next time." Barron didn't argue, but his silence had weight. Around them, a few passengers exchanged glances, sensing the tension. A little while later, the same woman asked Barron for help again, this time with her jacket in the overhead bin. He didn't hesitate, retrieving it with the same quiet politeness. Jessica, however, seemed to materialize out of thin air, her presence looming over the interaction. "Mr. Trump," she said, her tone louder now, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. "As I've already mentioned, passengers in business class should remain seated and let the crew handle these matters. It's disruptive to our workflow." A murmur swept through the cabin. Barron, his calm demeanor intact, returned to his seat without a word, but this time his jaw tightened just slightly. The passengers around him started whispering, their curiosity now fully piqued. Jessica turned on her heel and walked off, but her footsteps sounded more like a challenge than a retreat. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. It was no longer just another flight. It was the start of something none of them would soon forget. A few hours into the flight, the once calm atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. It wasn't one specific thing, but a combination of small, sharp moments that slowly built into something much bigger. You could feel it, like a storm brewing, just waiting for the right gust of wind to blow it wide open. Barron Trump, as chill as ever, had kept to himself for most of the flight. He He wasn't interested in the whispers or the occasional phone camera pointed his way. But when the flight attendants began serving meals, he casually flagged down one of the crew members. "Hey, can I ask what's in this?" he said, pointing to the tray in front of him. "I've got some allergies, and I just want to make sure I don't end up, regretting this mid-flight." Before the crew member could respond, Jessica swooped in, her polished shoes clicking against the floor like a countdown timer. "Hi, Mr. Trump," she said, her tone clipped and professional, but with just enough edge to make it clear she wasn't impressed. "Passengers are expected to notify us of dietary restrictions before the flight. We cannot accommodate last-minute requests." Barron looked at her, his expression neutral, but his eyebrows raising ever so slightly. "I'm not asking for a custom order. I'm just asking what's in it." Her response came quick, like she had rehearsed it. "The menu is standard, and we cannot provide ingredient lists for every item. If you have concerns, I suggest you avoid the meal." The tension in her voice was impossible to ignore, and by now, passengers nearby were leaning in, sensing the growing friction. Barron simply nodded, pushed the tray aside, and leaned back in his seat. But the energy in the cabin had shifted. Passengers started murmuring, sharing glances that said, "What is her deal?" As the plane cruised through the clouds, Jessica decided to escalate things. Midway through the flight, she picked up the intercom and made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice loud and authoritative, "we would like to remind all passengers to adhere to airline policies and follow the instructions of the crew at all times. This ensures everyone's safety and comfort." She paused for dramatic effect, her gaze sweeping over the cabin before landing squarely on Barron. It wasn't subtle, and everyone knew exactly who she was targeting. Barron, for his part, stayed perfectly still, his face calm but his jaw tightening ever so slightly. If looks could speak, his would have said, "Seriously?" Passengers around him started to whisper louder now, their curiosity quickly turning into irritation. "What is her problem?" someone muttered. "He hasn't done anything." Another passenger added, "Feels like she's just picking a fight." And then it happened. The elderly woman, sitting behind Barron, the same one he had helped earlier, leaned forward and tapped his shoulder. "Excuse me, young man," she said softly. "I seem to have dropped my book. Would you mind helping me find it?" Barron didn't hesitate. "Of course," he said, standing up and scanning the floor around her seat. Within seconds, he had retrieved the book and handed it back to her with a small smile. "Here you go." Before he could sit back down, Jessica stormed over, her presence cutting through the air like a knife. "Mr. Trump," she snapped, her voice louder than it needed to be, "this is the third time you've disregarded our instructions. Your behavior is disruptive and a potential safety risk." Barron turned to face her, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not sure how helping someone find a book qualifies as a safety risk." Jessica didn't back down. "You were out of your seat without permission, and you've been repeatedly told to let the crew handle passenger needs." At this point, the murmurs among the passengers turned into open comments. "This is ridiculous," someone said. Another added, "He's literally just helping people." And then from a few rows back, a voice cut through the noise. "Excuse me," said a man in a suit, standing up and stepping into the aisle. "I'm an attorney, and I'd like to point out that this gentleman has not violated any policies. If anything, it's you who seems to be overstepping." The tension in the cabin exploded. Passengers were now pulling out their phones, recording the confrontation, as Jessica's face turned bright red. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling with frustration, "if you continue to disrupt this flight, I'll be forced to notify security upon landing." Barron crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "All I've done is help someone," he said simply. "If that's a problem, then maybe the problem isn't me." Jessica, visibly flustered, turned back to the intercom. "This flight will not continue with passengers refusing to follow instructions," she announced. "We are preparing to contact authorities upon landing." The cabin erupted. Passengers were openly protesting now, some calling out Jessica's behavior while others demanded to know why she was targeting Barron. Phones were held high, capturing every moment as the flight spiraled further out of control. Barron remained seated, calm amidst the chaos, but it was clear this situation was far from over. The cabin had reached its limit. Jessica, visibly flustered and determined to reclaim control, grabbed the intercom. Her voice rang out sharply, cutting through the murmurs of discontent. "Ladies and gentlemen, Due to repeated disruptions and refusal to follow the crew instructions, this flight will be making an unscheduled landing to remove the passenger causing these issues. The statement sent shockwaves through the cabin. Gasps and murmurs turned into outright protests. "She can't be serious," a man in a window seat muttered. "This is insane," a woman nearby added. "What exactly did he do wrong?" someone else chimed in. Barron Trump, who had stayed remarkably composed despite the mounting tension, finally stood. His towering frame and calm demeanor instantly drew everyone's attention. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but loud enough for all to hear. "You want to throw me off this plane for helping someone? Fine, I'll leave, but only if everyone here who thinks this is unfair comes with me." The silence was electric, like the air had been sucked out of the room, and then, as if on cue, the passengers erupted into applause. Cheers and shouts of support filled the space. "He's right!" someone yelled. "This is completely out of line," another passenger added. "I'm filing a formal complaint," a businesswoman declared, waving her phone. Jessica's face turned red as she struggled to maintain her authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a serious violation of in-flight policies," she snapped. "I must insist that you all return to your seats immediately." The elderly woman at the center of the controversy stood shakily, her voice trembling but firm. "He's just a kind young man. You can't treat him like this. It's not right." Her words broke through the chaos, uniting the passengers even further. Phones lit up as nearly every person in the cabin started recording the unfolding drama. Jessica, clearly overwhelmed, looked to the front of the plane for help. The commotion reached the cockpit, prompting the captain to step into the cabin. His face was calm but serious as he raised his hands for quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "I understand there's been some conflict during this flight. Let's work together to resolve it and ensure everyone's safety." Jessica quickly stepped forward. "Captain, this passenger has repeatedly—" The captain cut her off with a raised hand. "Jessica, I'll take it from here." Turning to Barron, he addressed him directly. "Mr. Trump, can we agree to move forward without further incident?" Barron nodded. "All I've done is help someone. If that's a problem, then maybe the problem isn't me." The captain glanced around at the passengers, who were nodding in agreement. With a resigned sigh, he made his decision. "Jessica, please return to your duties. We're continuing to Los Angeles." Jessica, defeated, walked back to the galley. Her departure met with a smattering of applause. Barron turned to the passengers and held up a hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "Let's just get to where we're going." The rest of the flight was uneventful, but the damage had been done. By the time the plane landed, videos of the confrontation had gone viral, racking up thousands of views and sparking heated debates online. As passengers disembarked, many stopped to thank Barron or shake his hand. The elderly woman gave him a hug, her voice soft but sincere. "You're a good boy," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Barron smiled. "Just doing what felt right," he replied. Jessica remained out of sight as the passengers exited. For Barron, it wasn't about going viral or making headlines. It was about standing up when it mattered. And that's exactly what everyone would remember. What would you have done in Barron's place? Do you think he handled it the right way? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you or your friends ever experienced something similar? Don't forget to like this story if it resonated with you and spread the word by sharing it with others. This story was created to shed light on issues of fairness and compassion. It's a reminder that small acts of kindness can make a big difference and that standing up for what's right can inspire change. Your opinion matters, and together we can make the world a better place.